FORA.tv. The world is thinking.
With regard to public policy, such a broad range of government-based initiatives that acted as a driver of this process. And in many cases, they were policies specifically geared toward Fannie and Freddie, the affordable housing goals, for example, the political decision to protect their charter, the political decision not to pass reform legislation when we had an opportunity in 2005, legislation that would have scaled back the size of their investment portfolios, increased their capital standards, and given their regulator the typical powers of a bank supervisor. But then there are also the policy and the goals embodied in President Bush's quote. We need to increase home ownership through FHA. We need to find ways to enable people to purchase homes with a smaller and smaller down payment. It was a federal government policy to find ways to allow people to buy homes with the smallest down payment possible, even no down payment, if they qualified. And CRA, the Reinvestment Act, Community Reinvestment Act, I view that as simply part of this very broad range of government policies that Tony described, increase government ownership by about 5%, home ownership by about 5 percentage points. But the consequences of those policies is really quite devastating. Why? Just a couple thoughts on why that policy was driven as hard as it was by Republican and Democratic presidents, by Democrats and some Republicans in Congress. A lot of people point to the political clout of Fannie and Freddie, and they certainly were big institutions with big lobbying groups and enormous charitable foundations that just found a way to attend every housing event back in your home state or home district, and that carried with it a lot of political sway, if you will, and persuasion. But I think equally important is that members of Congress feared, because they didn't understand the complexity of these issues necessarily, and weren't able to explain exactly why Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were candidates for reform and better regulation. They didn't want to appear to be anti-housing. I mean, the only thing worse than being anti-housing is being anti-education. And so the lobbying groups that members of Congress would know very well, maybe it was the realtors or the home builders, good, hardworking people, small business men and women from your state or district would come and visit you and say, well, you've got to support Fannie and Freddie and you've got to oppose Sununu's reform bill because it's good for housing. You know, we've got to support these institutions because they're good for housing. And most members of Congress would take that at face value and say, yeah, you're right, I don't want to be anti-housing. So maybe I won't co-sponsor that bill, and I'll stay away from the issue. And obviously, by 2008, when we finally passed that legislation in July of 2008, that Chuck Hagel and I had worked on for quite some time, it was fair to say that's under the dictionary where the phrase "closing the door, barn door after the horses have left." That's pretty much the picture right there.